Hello and welcome to Top Story. EU and African leaders meet in a summit in Portugal this weekend that's clouded by acrimony even before it begins. The decision by British Prime Minister Gordon Brown not to go because of the attendance of Zimbabwean leader Robert Mugabe has deflected attention away from key issues like trade, development, migration and AIDS. Britain accuses Mugabe of stifling internal debate, serial human rights abuse and presiding over the ruin of a once vibrant economy. The Zimbabwean president is joined in Lisbon by the heads of state of 47 other African countries. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that while the issue of Zimbabwe should not be swept under the carpet, it was important not to let it dominate the agenda, the subtext of which is the rapidly growing economic and political influence of China. The European Union is still Africa's biggest trading partner, but there are fears that unless it develops a better political relationship with Africa, it could find itself marginalised. Well, joining me now to discuss what's at stake in Lisbon is Vincent Ougeux of L'Express magazine and the author of a book on Africa, The White Witch Doctors and France's Africa Policy. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. This is the first summit of its kind since 2000. There was meant to have been another one in 2003, but that wasn't held. So what went wrong in the intervening years?
Well, basically, the Mugabe factor has already overshadowed the stakes of this summit. And it's not a new story, by the way. Already in 2001, at the time of Tony Blair, one summit of that kind was cancelled. And later on, in 2003, already in Lisbon, there was supposed to be another summit, and it was postponed just because you had a blockade on the attendance of Mugabe and the relationship with London.
But this summit has already been overshadowed by the Gordon Brown affair, the decision of the British Prime Minister not to attend. Do you think he's right not to attend?
Well, I think that to a certain extent, it's very true that the summit has been poisoned by this. I think that he is somehow consistent in the political line of London in the past few years, and I would say there is no break with the Tony Blair's era in that respect. But the problem is that, including in Europe, some consider that to focus so much on a personal, because it appears as such, even if the background is political, but a personal hostility is something which might, in fact, alleviate the political weight of what is supposed to be at stake during that summit. So he has been mildly criticized by some of his partners. And we mentioned earlier Angela Merkel, and it's very clear that it's not the kind of behavior that she would favor.
The Africans, in particular Robert Mugabe, of course, are calling it neo-colonialism. Do they have a point, do you think, in accusing the British of neo-colonialism?
Well, I think that basically it pays off in Africa, but obviously it's lip service. The only point which might be approved on the Mugabe side is that it's true that at one point London stopped some financial commitment, some assistance, but for good reason. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, Zimbabwe used to appear at the granary of Africa. I mean, and the reality is that Robert Mugabe, the terrible Bob, ruined this country. But, what is very paradoxical is that he still appears as a hero in Africa. And we must understand that factor today.
That's the question I was going to ask you. It's a bit of a paradox, at least it appears a paradox to many outsiders. Why are African leaders so reluctant to criticize a man who is clearly a serial human rights abuser?
That's very true. First factor is historical. He still appears and is banking on that as a hero, and a genuine one, by the way, of the frontline countries at the time of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, an abject regime, by the way. But still, today, he appears also as the one who resists the ugly neocolonialism of the Western world. And obviously is also banking on that, on a very populist mood. And number three, and even if it's something which is not explicitly quoted, he's the one who, after all, expelled the white farmers. So altogether, including in the African elite, it's very difficult for them to admit that the dark side of the character has now completely overshadowed the bright side, if any, of the past.
As I was saying, the subtext to this summit is very much China, the growing concern in Europe that China is marginalizing Europe, pushing them to the sidelines. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that China doesn't attach aid to conditions on things like human rights abuse and good governance. How does Europe deal with that problem?
Well, basically one of the challenges of this summit is to thwart the Chinese influence, the growing Chinese influence in Africa. Let's say that 1 year ago or so, you had a very impressive summit in Beijing. 48 heads of state there, and more heads of state for the last Franco-African summit of Chirac's era in France. So, and they were just, rushing to Beijing for a very simple reason also. As you said, I mean, China is the kingdom of easy money today. Unconditional loans and no condition attached whatsoever as far as, for example, human rights are concerned.
Does this mean that, say, Europe is bound to lose in Africa? I mean, it still is the biggest trading partner with Africa.
Still true. China is still number 3, but it's clearly on the rise. And so I think that it would be a very hazardous attempt for Europe, for example, to abandon the human rights, for example, or good governance factors and conditions attached to the assistance. Because my feeling when I talk to Africans, be they, ordinary people or leaders, is that the fascination for China somehow is already short-lived, because they are considering that for heads of states of, I would say, an authoritarian regime, obviously China is the good option. Okay, as much as you want. No interest rate whatsoever, and no human rights conditions attached. But for the civil society, it's already highly criticized. People don't like this. Number 2, the influx of China is not so good for the ordinary people, because they come with their raw material, with their equipment, and also with their manpower. So the benefit for ordinary people is almost non-existent or marginal, plus the fact that they have flooded Africa with very mediocre products. They are aware of that, by the way. They try now to improve the quality of their products. But it's true that when you talk to, for example, a maman in a market in Lomé or in Dakar, Senegal, she would tell you that she has been ruined by this.
And I'm going to have to stop you there, I'm afraid. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to our guest, Vincent Ougeux. Join us again next week for another edition of Top Story. Have a good weekend. Goodbye.